Bolshevism and its toll on Russia and East Europe was one of the most devastating atrocities that ever occurred. While most genocides are fairly recorded in the history books, the impact of Bolshevism and Marxism is very unclear for the most part. Those who died at the hands of Bolshevism did so silently, with the world either not caring or not knowing what really happened. Today, in this video, I will attempt to bring these atrocities to light, in loving memory of every single victim, Christian, European, or otherwise, who died at the hands of Jewish tyranny. A conservative estimate of the death toll sits at around 66 million, and that does not even include those who died during World War I or World War II. Although nobody truly knows how many died or suffered during this time, due to the censorship and suppression of journalism and literature. This video alone will not do the victims justice. My words alone cannot do the crimes justice at all. The crucifixion of Russia and East Europe will leave a scar that lasts forever. The crimes that occurred in these days are rarely discussed, actively avoided, whitewashed, and even dismissed. It is my hopes to bring their story to you, that they may serve as a reminder, but also to honour them in loving memory with the dignity and respect that they deserve. In the early 20th century, Europe was home to a tangled network of alliances which saw many nations being pitted against one another. Tensions increasingly grew over time, with nations attempting to use their alliances and power to seize control of other territories. By the turn of 1914, the European powers were divided into two coalitions: the Triple Entente, consisting of France, Russia and Britain, and the Triple Alliance, consisting of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. A little-known fact was the relationship certain leaders of European nations had with one another. Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, his wife Alexandria, Kaiser of Wilhelm of Germany, were all actually first cousins of King George V of the United Kingdom. Additionally, King George was a first cousin, through King Christian IX, of both Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and King Constantine I of Greece. George and Nicholas, however, are said to have been particularly close, both of which kept a good relationship with one another. They are seen in many photos together dressed very similarly, perhaps showing off the fact that they could be mistook as twins. In one photo, the two monarchs are seen posing with their sons and respective royal heirs, Tsarevich Alexei and Prince Edward. What seemed to have been a family squabble, whether scripted or real, eventually led to World War I breaking out in 1914. The closeness that George and Nicholas had shared didn't seem to be enough to prevent this. There had already been several wars and battles fought in Europe over the centuries, and at that time, the Great War, later to be known as the First World War, was said to be the war to end all wars. However, this is really where our story begins. By the year 1915, there were many reasons presented as to whether America should join the war or not. The most inflammatory, perhaps, was the sinking of the Lusitania, a British passenger ship which had many American passengers aboard. Through the help of the Jewish-controlled American media, it became widespread knowledge that Germany had sunk this ship due to its hostilities with Britain. However, many historians now accept this act to have been a false flag, used as a provocation in getting America into the war. Equally significant, before the tragedy, Winston Churchill, who was an agent of the British Jewish banking elites, who at the time was the head of the British Admiralty, had ordered a close study to be done to determine what the political impact would be if a passenger ship was sunk with Americans on board. By the time America had joined the war, Japan and many other nations had done so also. This led to an all-out, banking-financed world war. It is said that perhaps Nicholas II did not perceive just how big this war was going to be, but with the war raging on, it soon became obvious. The Russian army, who was mostly made up of peasants and the working class, who were undertrained and not very well equipped, this resulted in many unnecessary deaths and food shortages that prolonged into 1916. By the 25th of June, Nicholas II, Tsar of Russia, issued a decree ordering the conscription of Central Asians and Southern Russians into the war, in hopes of bolstering the chances at defeating their opponents. From the very beginning of the war, orders were given locally for the expulsion of the Jews from army areas of Russia, specifically those who were on the front of war. One of the reasons behind this was due to them being known for conscription dodging, tax evading, and the crime of espionage. As testified by Dr. Pasamanik, a medic on the front during the war, quote, "Suddenly, throughout the area of the front and in all circles close to power, spread the rumour that the Jews were doing espionage," unquote. These accusations may not have come about without the help of German General Staff, which issued a proclamation calling on the Jews of Russia to rise up against their government. But opinion, supported by many sources, prevails that in this case it was Polish influence at work. In addition to accusations against the Jews living in these areas, the Jews were accused of cowardice and desertion. According to Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his book 200 Years Together, quote, "Of course, the Jews in the front could not break their ties with their neighbouring villages, interrupt the Jewish post, and turn into the enemies of their co-religionists. Moreover, in the eyes of the Jews in the Pale of the Settlement, the Germans appeared as a European nation of high culture, much different from the Russians." At that time, Times correspondent Stephen Graham reported, as soon as the smoke of a German ship appeared at the horizon, the Jewish population of Libava forgot the Russian language and began to speak German. If they had to leave, the Jews preferred to go to the German side. The hostility displayed by the Russian army and then their deportation could only provoke their bitterness and cause some of them to collaborate openly with the Germans, unquote. By the start of 1916, one of the men who fled into exile was a guy named Lenin, taking up residence in Switzerland. As always, his mind stayed focused on revolutionary politics. During this period, he wrote and published Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, 1916. Despite popular belief, Lenin was actually Jewish. We know this to be true because of newly released documentation by Russia. Lenin, whose real name was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, chose the pseudonym Lenin in 1901 following his Siberian exile for attempting to publish an illegal newspaper called The Workers' Cause. Lenin's grandfather and mother were Ashkenazi Jews. Under pressure by the communist government, Lenin's Jewish roots were kept secret until after his death. Lenin was also a crypto-Jew who tried to conceal his Jewishness by converting to Christianity in his early days, as did most of his family. He came from a poor Jewish family and was, according to his baptismal certificate, the son of Moses Blank, a native of Zhytomyr, a province of Ukraine. By 1916, in the United Kingdom, Lloyd George became Prime Minister of the wartime coalition. During that same month, royal advisor Grigory Rasputin was murdered by a group of Russian nobles in the house of Prince Felix Yusupov. It was believed he was responsible for some of the poor decisions being made by Nicholas II. Rasputin was a very mysterious man, known for being a mystic and a self-proclaimed holy man, who befriended the family of Tsar Nicholas II and gained considerable influence in late Imperial Russia. In the year 1917, One of the starting points of the Bolshevik Revolution, primarily piloted by Jews who hated Russia, came out of the closet during what is known as the February Revolution. On the 22nd of February, the workers at the Putilov plant in Petrograd went on strike. By the following day, a series of demonstrations were held, demanding the end of the Russian autocracy and the end of the Russian participation in World War I. There were no newspapers during the first week of the revolutionary events in Petrograd promoting the strikes. However, due to foreign banking interests, alongside the revolutionary Jew who looked to take advantage of the situation, they began trumpeting, not looking for the ways to rebuild the state, but by vying with each other in denouncing all things of the past. Through the control of the media, revolution was actually promoted. In an unprecedented gesture, the newspaper of the Constitutional Democrats, known as Cadets, REC, announced that from now on, quote, all Russian life must be rebuilt from its roots, unquote. Strikes continue to expand, with more than 200,000 workers now involved, leading to occasional violent clashes between protesters and police. In an attempt to squash this anarchy, on the 25th of February, a battalion of soldiers was sent to Petrograd to end the uprising. On top of this, Nicholas ordered the dissolution of the Fourth Duma. The Duma ignored his order and decreed the establishment of a provisional government with Gregory Lvov as Prime Minister. On the 27th of February, the soldiers sent to suppress the protesters defected and joined the Bolsheviks. Two garrisons of soldiers in Petrograd shoot their officers rather than obeying orders to fire on civilians. The returning soldiers had mostly joined the Bolsheviks on the word of protesters who had informed them about the current state of affairs. Menshevik leaders were freed from Peter and Paul Fortress and founded the Petrograd Soviet. The protest turned to anarchy and chaos, which resulted in the Tsar losing control of the capital. Upon hearing words of this, on the 28th of February, the Tsar attempts to return to Petrograd, but is delayed by railway problems in Pskov. The Duma and the Petrograd Soviet both meet during this time to plan a new course of action for the country. The Duma and the Petrograd Soviet both meet to plan a course of action for the country during this time. And by March the 1st, the leaders of France, Britain formally recognized the provisional government as the official government of Russia. Alexander Solzhenitsyn explains in his book 200 Years Together the first course of action proposed by the provisional government. Quote, the equality of the Jews advanced very quickly. The 1st of March, old calendar style, one day before the abdication, a few hours before the infamous Order No. 1, which pushed the army into collapse. V. Makalov and M. Adzimov, two commissaries of the Duma committee delegated to the Ministry of Justice, had issued an internal Ministry of Justice directive ordering to enlist all Jewish assistants to attorneys at law into the Guild of Judicial Attorneys. By the 2nd of March 1917, it became obvious to Nicholas II that his control over Russia was very fastly diminishing. As a result of this coup attempt, under duress, Nicholas abdicated his throne and leadership. Already by March the 3rd, the chairman of the State Duma, M. Rodzianko, and the Prime Minister of the Provisional Government, Prince G. Lvov, signed a declaration which stated that one of the main goals of the new government is a repeal of all restrictions based upon religion, nationality, and social class. Then on the 4th of March, the Defense Minister Gukshov proposed to open a path for the Jews to become military officers, and the Minister of Education, Manulov, proposed to repeal the percentage quotas on the Jews. Both proposals were accepted without obstacles. Prior to this, no Jew was allowed to be an officer in the military. By the time March came around, 1917, it became very obvious that this new revolution was looking more and more like a push for the political expediency of the revolutionary Jew. Towards the end of March 1917, members of the State Duma, the State Assembly, had joined the Provisional Government, which was to hold power until a Constituent Assembly was elected to give Russia a new constitution. The Provisional Government at this time had no choice but to share power with the Petrograd Soviet, a council elected by workers and soldiers who engaged in the February Revolution. The reason the Provisional Government had to share power with the Petrograd Soviet Council was because the Petrograd Soviet at this time controlled the capital's troops, transports and communications. The Rothschild family had a formula which many of their allies supported. On one hand, Zionism, as a political movement, was gaining momentum. By getting America into World War I on the side of the British government, in turn, through the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, had promised to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. We know this because of the Balfour Declaration, a letter signed in 1917. Also, Jewish-Polish writer E. Malinsky also suggests that America's entrance into the war on the side of the Allies was due to Jewish influence, and that if it had not been for the Lusitania affair, also made possible by Winston Churchill, America may not have entered the war at all. On the other hand of this Rothschild family formula, we know that Jewish bankers and other financiers were directly involved in propping up Trotsky and other Bolshevik revolutionists. Jacob Schiff was head of the New York investment firm Kuhn, Loeb & Co. He was one of the principal backers of the Bolshevik Revolution and personally financed Trotsky's trip from New York to Russia. When Trotsky returned to Petrograd in May of 1917 to organize the Bolshevik phase of the Russian Revolution, he carried $10,000 US in travel expenses, a generous, ample fund considering the value of the dollar at that time, and for the fact that he'd only earned about $12 a week while he was in America, that's also pretty good. It was also the American government who gave Trotsky a passport. This American passport was accompanied by a Russian entry permit and a British transit visa. So between Zionism and Bolshevism, we can see how both sides of the dialectic work together. It was certainly beneficial for Russia's Jews, whose descendants eventually flocked in droves to the Jewish state. So much so that Jerusalem alone today is home to more Jews than all of Russia. By the end of April, in what is known as the Wall Street Project began in Russia and used the Red Cross mission and its operational vehicle to aid the revolution. However, this was not for humanitarian purposes, as there was only 4 doctors who were a part of this trip at the time. The real purpose of this mission was to offer financial support to the Bolsheviks. All expenses, including those of the uniforms, the members were all colonels, majors, captains, or lieutenants, were paid out of the pocket of William Boyce Thompson, a Jewish financier who was also a major donor to the Republican Party in the United States. Other notable people who were financing the Red Cross in America during this time included J.P. Morgan, Jewish banker, and Cleveland H. Dodge, Jewish financier. In exchange for raising funds, Wall Street asked for the Red Cross War Council, and on the recommendation of Cleveland H. Dodge, one of Woodrow Wilson's financial backers, Henry P. Davidson, a partner in J.P. Morgan Company, became chairman. During this time, both Guaranteed Trust and National City Bank had representatives in Russia at the time of the revolution. In June, a new Russian military offensive in Austria-Hungary ended in disaster, with 400,000 Russian casualties. This resulted in massive desertions and a collapse in army morale and discipline. In July, Russian soldiers and sailors in Petrograd mutinied. They were joined in the streets by Bolshevik support. This played to the advantage of the Bolsheviks, who opposed the war. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were a faction of the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, who eventually became the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, who advocated at the time for land redistribution and the end to the war, all of which was being financed by Western banking elites, who sought to use the promise of prosperity for the common man as a tool to win over the hearts of Russian peasants, workers and soldiers. The ideology of Marxism didn't arrive organically or in a vacuum. It came about from a man named Karl Marx, whose real name was Chaim Herschel Mordecai. Karl was a Prussian-born theorist who was the son of a rabbi. The ideology of Karl was used to push Europe to the brink of destruction under the guise of anti-capitalism. Ironically, however, his efforts were financed by Jewish bankers and Western powers. The ideology of Marxism still has its hold on Western countries even today. Between the Bolsheviks and the Provisional Government of Russia looking to seize more power at the time, disagreements seemed to be unavoidable. In what is now known as July Days, a spontaneous pro-Soviet demonstration occurred on the streets of Petrograd. This resulted with the Provisional Government using its force to put the rebellion down, and on the 6th of July they also ordered the arrest of certain Bolshevik leaders, including Leon Trotsky. The Provisional Government at this time didn't see eye to eye with Trotsky and wanted him imprisoned until such time that they could cool the storm that was brewing. The foreign banking interests in New York and London had put Trotsky in place as an agent to be the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution. Trotsky, whose real name was Lev Davidovich Bronstein, was a Jew who had previously been living in New York, being monitored, mentored and financed by Wall Street bankers. During the month of July 1917, Alexander Kerensky succeeded Lvov as Prime Minister of Russia. And in the month of August, what is now known as the Kornilov Affair took place, in which General Lavir Kornilov ordered an army corps to Petrograd to destroy the Soviets. Kornilov was the Russian commander-in-chief who believed Russia's war effort was being undermined. He believed the chaos in Russia was being deliberately escalated by people like Lenin, who he believed was a Jewish spy working for the Germans. With the Russian military inbound to destroy the Soviets, the Provisional Government armed tens of thousands of Red Guard Bolsheviks to defend Petrograd from the attempted military coup. Thousands of people died during this time. However, the Bolsheviks did manage to succeed, and on the 31st of August, Kornilov was arrested. By the 4th of September, the Provisional Government, now under pressure from the Bolsheviks and their Jewish Wall Street financiers, released the Bolshevik leaders from prison, including Leon Trotsky. With the majority of the Bolsheviks now being unmatched in their power in Petrograd, Lenin, who was in hiding in Finland under the direction of Jewish bankers in Germany, decided to return to Petrograd and lead the reign of the Bolsheviks. Lenin, now in power, had no need for the Provisional Government or their direction, who then called for a coup in what would now be known as the October Revolution. On the 25th of October, soldiers directed by the Military Revolutionary Committee of the Petrograd Soviet captured the Winter Palace, ending the power of the Russian Provisional Government. The Bolsheviks finally take over and are now fully in charge, with all of their leadership comprising of Jewish revolutionaries who are under the direction of bankers and intelligence circles in the West. 1917, the Russian Civil War begins, with Lenin and the Red Army seizing strategic locations and killing counter-revolutionaries known as the White Army, who had some elements of foreign support. Some of the White Army had wished to put Tsar Nicholas II back on the throne and re-establish power. Due to an increased amount of people fighting for the Jewish-controlled Bolsheviks, a heartless methodology was implemented in the regions in and around Tambov City and Penza City to seize grains and crops during the summer. The Bolsheviks also seized livestock, farms, and their implements. These purposely imposed taxations and grain seizures were used as a psychological weapon of war to increase the levels of starvation in hopes of instigating native resistance, which would then provide a plausible excuse for the Bolshevik authorities to use lethal force against the population. Beatings and rape were also used as a weapon to put fear into the people and keep them in line when things got out of hand. In the city of Tambov, the Bolshevik authorities were also accused of deliberately leaving cartloads of grain in the open air to rot. The Tambov massacre had all the characteristics of a dry run in which the Bolshevik Red Army first exercised all its dreadful force against the civilian population, revealing that Lenin had discovered a powerful weapon against the ethnic European Christian people. They didn't torture and oppress people because they thought they had to, but because they could. The Red Terror was a campaign of mass torture, murder, and systematic oppression conducted by the Jewish Bolsheviks during 1918. The Cheka and the Red Army executed numerous European farmers. At Odessa, the Cheka tied white officers to planks and slowly fed them into furnaces or tanks of boiling water. In Kharkiv, scalpings and hand flayings were commonplace. The Romanov family and their loyal servants were imprisoned in the Alexander Palace before being moved to Tobolsk and then to Yekaterinburg, where they were finally killed, allegedly at the express command of Vladimir Lenin. Despite being informed that the entire family suffered the same fate as its head, the Bolsheviks only announced Nicholas's death with the official press release that Nicholas Romanov's wife and son had been sent to a secure place. The Russian Imperial Romanov family, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Tsarina Alexandra, and their 5 children Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, and all those who chose to accompany them into imprisonment, notably Eugene Bokhtin, Anna Demidova, Alexei Trup, and Ivan Kharitonov, were shot, bayoneted, and clubbed to death on the 9th of the 16th of July 1918. The Tsar and his family were killed by several Bolshevik troops, including Peter Ermakov and led by Yakov Yurovsky under the orders of the Ural Regional Soviet and according to instructions by Lenin, Yakov Sfliadov and Felix Dzerzhinsky, all of which were Jewish. Their bodies were then taken to the Koptyaki forest where they were stripped and mutilated. The assassination of Tsar Nicholas II and his family horrified the then British King George. At least one of his daughters were raped in front of him while he was forced to watch. Witnesses attest to the hearing of the screams of her while she was being beaten, tortured and raped. Colonel Pavel Rodzanko says, quote, "I saw in the room in which the murder took place obscene drawings with inscriptions, partly obliterated since, but clear enough to read. There were horrible pictures of Rasputin and the Empress, and inscriptions boasting of outrage, and the shrieks that were heard that night tend to confirm this. Anything more horrible than the last week of the family cannot be imagined." Unquote. New documents released by the Russian government states the Bolsheviks took sexual liberties with the dead bodies of the girls before mutilating them, covering them in sulfuric acid and tossing them down a mine shaft. Yurovsky and his men apparently left with about 20 pounds of royal jewels they had stolen from the family in a bag. Rothschild at this time had complete control over the British aristocracy. A combination between this and Jewish financing of the Bolsheviks resulted in the necessity of King George to turn his back on Nicholas II being murdered in a symbolically blood-libel fashion. On the 11th of November, the First World War officially comes to an end. An estimated 2 million lives were lost to this war, while a typhus epidemic and famine took the lives of around 10 million more. By the year of 1919, the Comintern, or Third International, is formed in Moscow, with the aim of spreading revolution all over the world. There seemed to be very little thought on grain production or the betterment of the Russian people, who had already been through so much devastation. During this time, the Latvian War of Independence breaks out, in which the Red Army invades Latvia and stages an offensive against the surrounding forces. The Soviet offensives met little resistance during this time, due to be taken by surprise. While this was occurring, another battle was being fought by the Bolsheviks in what is known as the Estonian War of Independence. In January, while these battles were being fought, the Bolsheviks executed many Christians and minor royals who had attempted to resist the Bolshevik takeover. Like the Romanovs, these royals were executed in brutal fashion, some of which were even crucified on a cross. In the midst of these Bolshevik-led offensives and slaughters, Finland decides to declare war on the Bolshevik regime in Russia. With Bolshevik forces being spread thin, this enabled the White Army to launch a surprise attack against the Red Army. In October, the White Army General Yudenich launches an assault on Petrograd that almost succeeds in capturing the city, which is a very critical point in the Civil War. However, after a month-long battle, Yudenich's forces are pushed back by the Red Army reinforcements and take refuge in Estonia. With the battle won, the Estonian War of Independence, which resulted in around 5,000 people being murdered by the Bolsheviks, came to an end. Soviet Russia signed the Treaty of Tartau, renouncing most claims on Estonian territory. The agreed frontier corresponded roughly with the positions of the front line at the cessation of the hostilities. In October 1919, Lenin paid a secret visit to the laboratory of great physiologist I.P. Pavlov, a Russian physiologist known chiefly for the concept of conditional reflex. In his classic experiment, he found that a hungry dog can be trained to associate the sound of a bell with food and will salivate at the sound even in the absence of food. Lenin wanted to find out if his work on the conditional reflexes of the brain might help the Bolsheviks control European behavior. Quote, "I want the masses of Russia to follow a communistic pattern of thinking and reacting," Lenin explained. Pavlov was astounded. It seemed that Lenin wanted him to do for humans what he had already done for dogs. Quote, "Do you mean that you would like to standardize the population of Russia? Make them all behave in the same manner?" he asked. "Exactly," replied Lenin. "Man can be corrected. Man can be made what we want him to be." Unquote. Not only did the Bolsheviks engage in a physical war, but also a psychological one. They wanted all of the people of Europe to respect them, whether through fear or through consent. By February 1920, with many successes of the Bolsheviks, the White Army commander Kolchak is captured and executed. The signing of the Latvian-Soviet Riga Peace Treaty on the 11th of August 1920 brought an end to the Latvian War of Independence, in which around 2,000 people were brutally murdered by the Bolsheviks. In battles being ended on two fronts, the Bolshevik and the Red Army were able to put their sights on other targets. This included the invasion of Azerbaijan, Bukhara, and Armenia. After the invasion, the Armenian Prime Minister gave up control of the country to the invading Bolsheviks. This also resulted in the looting and desecration of many Christian holy sites. By the end of 1920, in November, General Wrangel's White Army, under siege from the Reds in Crimea, evacuate via the Black Sea. At this time, most major fighting in the Civil War is concluded, although localized skirmishes and peasant uprisings still continue. By the beginning of 1921, the ruble had lost 96% of its pre-war value. Industrial production has fallen to 10% of its 1913 level. The population of Petrograd has fallen from 2.5 million in 1917 to 600,000 in 1920. However, due to the Bolsheviks' lust and greed for power, very little thought was put into empowering the people of Russia. Following the events of rapes, executions, and beatings being imposed on the Russians in the area of Tambov, resistance grew rapidly. By the start of 1921, more than 14,000 men armed with rifles, pitchforks, and scythes had chased out or killed all representatives of the Jewish Bolshevik regime from the 3 districts of Tambov city. In the space of a few weeks, this specific native resistance, which at first could not be distinguished from hundreds of others that had broken out all over Russia and Ukraine over the previous 2 years, was transformed into a organized uprising under the inspirational leadership of a first-class patriot, Alexander Stepanovich Antonov. Alexander Antonov was a Christian man who gave many in the area hope of overcoming the persecution imposed on them by the Bolsheviks. The European inhabitants flocked by the thousands to join Antonov's army, which at its peak numbered more than 50,000. However, this hope and desire for peace and prosperity was very short-lived. After the defeat of Wrangel in the Crimea, the number of Red Army troops deployed to Tambov province quickly reached 100,000. Henceforth, the Red Army used heavy artillery, armoured trains, and engaged in the summary execution of civilians. By the end of March, Britain and many other nations signed a bilateral trading agreement with Russia in hopes that lifting trade blockades would serve to benefit all nations involved. These trade agreements was another way of the bankers in the West getting money to the Bolsheviks, who at this time had dominant control over Russia. From the end of June 1921 until the fall of autumn 1921, chemical weapons developed and weaponized by Jewish chemist Fritz Haber during World War I were used by the direct order of Communist Party and Bolshevik Red Army leadership. Order number 171, dated 11th of June 1921 and signed by Vladimir Overzenko, shows clearly the sorts of methods used to pacify Tambov province. It stipulated 1. Shoot on sight any citizens who refuse to give their names. 2. District and regional political commissions are hereby authorized to pronounce sentence on any village where arms are being hidden, and to arrest hostages and shoot them if the whereabouts of their arms are not revealed. 3. Wherever arms are found, execute immediately the oldest son in the family. 4. Any family that has harbored a bandit is to be arrested and deported from the province. Their possessions are to be seized. The oldest son is to be executed immediately. 5. Any families sheltering other families who have been harboring bandits are to be punished in the same manner, and their oldest son is to be shot. 6. In the event that the bandit family has fled, their possessions are to be redistributed among peasants who are loyal to the Soviet Bolshevik regime, and their houses are to be burned or demolished. 7. These orders are to be carried out rigorously and without mercy. In 1922, Lenin would suffer the first of several strokes, which affects his health and his ability to lead. Lenin dictates his political testament, a series of letters containing his views about the future of Soviet Russia, the Communist Party, and its potential leaders. And on the 3rd of April 1922, Stalin is appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party. By the 29th of December, the Treaty on the creation of the USSR united its signatories. The Russian and Transcaucasian SFSRs and the Belarusian and Ukrainian SSRs are under the power of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. By the end of this year, the creation of the Soviet Union is made official. With Russia now in control of its former enemies and its surrounding neighbours, very little could be done to stop the Soviet Union. At the turn of 1923, the relationship between Stalin and Lenin breaks down after Stalin is rude and insulting to Krupskaya, Lenin's wife. However, the hostilities are soon put to rest by the month of March, when Lenin suffers a third stroke that leaves him paralysed and barely able to speak. By the month of May, Lenin is removed to a party sanatorium at Gorky, with Stalin given the responsibility for attending to his security, medical needs, and well-being. On the 21st of January 1924, Lenin dies, leading to a power struggle within the party. However, Stalin emerges as a party leader. Stalin himself was also a crypto-Jew. His real name is Losif Vissarionovich Dzhugashvili, and the pseudonym Stalin actually means Man of Steel, sort of like Superman. The Georgian-born Stalin adopted his pseudonym in 1910 as what was likely an effort to, first, be intimidating, and second, to shield his real identity from the police while he was involved in an evasive revolutionary activity. Stalin met Lenin in 1905, and the two already knew each other and had been working together for 5 years before Stalin adopted his new name. So both men knew very well of each other's Jewish roots. Stalin's place of birth, Gori, was home to the largest Georgian Jewish population at that time, with Jewish groups such as Legashvili being one of the largest groups of Jews in the country of Georgia. Something to highlight is Stalin's original surname, at birth, was Dzhugashvili, and as we know, this name means son of a Jew. It is also known that Joseph Stalin had at least 3 Jewish wives, which meant that his children were also Jewish. He also spoke Yiddish around his family. Upon Lenin's death in early 1924, his body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum near the Moscow Kremlin. Petrograd was renamed Leningrad in his honor. On the 7th of March 1924, the new gold ruble was introduced to stop inflation. This new ruble was the equivalent to 50,000 old rubles. It was during this time that Russia would undergo the start of its industrialization and state-controlled production. Stalin spent his first years after the revolution building his post as General Secretary secretly into the powerful half of the Communist Party. After Lenin's death in 1924, a triumvirate of Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev governed against Trotsky on the left wing of the party, and Bukharin on the right wing of the party. Stalin and Trotsky were not able to see eye to eye regarding the future of Russia. Soon after, Stalin switched sides and joined Bukharin. Together, they fought a new opposition of Trotsky, Kamenev, and Zinoviev. Stalin eventually removed Trotsky from the government and also from his position as the head of the Red Army. Stalin knew that Trotsky was his main rival and did not want him to be able to influence either policy making or the army. Indeed, Stalin feared that Trotsky could use the army to remove Stalin and make himself head of the government. As a result, of the Kulak grain strikes which followed soon after, prices had risen alarmingly. The opposition left, again, urged for a change in policy. Zinoviev and Kamenev now aligned themselves with Trotsky, forming the United Opposition. However, by the end of 1927, the left opposition leaders, Trotsky, Zinoviev and Kamenev, were removed from the Communist Party. By 1928, the first year of the 5-year plan was begun, and Stalin's supremacy over Russia was complete. Despite anti-Semitism being punishable by death in Soviet Russia at this time, Stalin was often accused of anti-Semitism, as he did implement measures to limit Jewish influence within his military officer ranks and political ranks. However, this was not out of hatred of Jews, as Stalin himself, who was a Jew, was still very much working towards the political expediency and the progress of those Jews who laid before him after the Bolshevik Revolution, but rather as an attempt to rid the party of any Trotsky influence that may have remained behind. Since it was Trotsky himself who put the generals in the army, it seemed like a good idea to Stalin. It wasn't the Jewishness that Stalin was distancing himself from, but the method of outcome. Trotsky had a global end goal, which Stalin initially shared even after Lenin had passed away. However, Stalin eventually transitioned himself to a more nationalist outlook and was more concerned with internal industrialization. To call Stalin anti-Semitic would be a dishonest assertion, as at least up until 1934, according to published statistics by the Soviet Union, 38.5% of those holding the most senior posts in the Soviet security apparatus were of Jewish origin, with many more being Freemasons. Respected Jewish historian Sebag Montefiore writes in his book Court of the Red Star that, quote, "When the communist killing machine worked in full force, Stalin was surrounded by beautiful young Jewish women," unquote. Prior to the creation of the CIA, it is now known that the Soviet Union and the United States were both being heavily directed by Jewish bankers on Wall Street and London about a build-up to World War II. Both the American government and the Russian government remained in secret communications through diplomatic back channels during this time. Also, Baron Edmund de Rothschild visited Stalin on numerous occasions during these years. By the end of 1928, Stalin introduced the first 5-year plan. Steel and iron production were to be increased considerably, as was the production of energy and tools. To achieve his aims, factories were to name and shame those who did not meet required production quotas. Workers who spoke out, slackened off, or fell ill were tortured and executed. During this time, the Central Committee stated that the state government had the right to exercise guidance over literature. This effectively introduced censorship over literature and the suppression of the media. In 1929, in hopes of boosting production, forced collectivization was introduced. All farmers were to pool their resources and work collectively to maximize production of their land. They were to work under the strict supervision of a staff of 25,000 workers who reported directly back to the Central Committee. A very harsh level of psychological warfare was also intact, in which farmer would dob in farmer in order to improve his production outgrowth. By November 1929, Matvei Berman, the son of a Jewish brickyard owner, had developed the Gulag system of concentration camps that defined Lenin's most cruel revolutionary terror, and in 1913 became deputy chief. The Gulag of the NKVD's system of forced labour and extermination camps. Any person suspected of disagreeing with the Jewish Bolshevik government could be kidnapped by the secret police or the Cheka and deported to a Gulag. The most infamous of these camps was the desolate island of Nazino, also known as Cannibal Island. Among the many atrocities, women and children were raped, tortured and butchered. In 1931, poverty was widespread and production quotas were not being met. An acute shortage of leather led to a government's ban on private production of shoes. This meant that people had to purchase state-made shoes, which were of poor quality and often fell apart. Grain procurement quotas for Ukraine were raised by 42% in the years of 1932 to 1935. Ukraine was the most productive agricultural region in the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the raising of quotas meant that there would not be enough food for the people of Ukraine. Despite the fact that people were literally starving to death, the Soviet policy of not allowing peasants access to food produced by the collective until quotas had been met meant that around 7 million people starved to death. This period in time became known as the Second Holodomor. Desperation was so severe that many peasants resorted to cannibalism and suicide. According to the surviving eyewitness accounts, Ukrainians survived on anything they could find, from the blossoms of acacia trees to the rotting flesh of cats and dogs, even to grass. For those who worked in the cities, life was not much better. Working conditions worsened with the introduction of a 7-day working week and unsafe conditions. Stalin claimed that equal wage was not possible in this time and that incentives were necessary in order to boost production. This meant that those that failed to meet targets were exiled, put in the Gulag, or executed as an enemy of the state. When listening to the stories and testimonies given by survivors and eyewitnesses, the harsh reality of the Second Holodomor is just too much to even imagine. It was one of the worst atrocities ever committed in modern history. Unlike most genocides, this was a slow and painful kill, with no hope or mercy. My words alone simply cannot do it justice. The psychological aspect of this alone is enough to make anybody's heart break. The Second Holodomor was not driven by greed alone, but hatred. To quote Alexander Solzhenitsyn, quote, "You must understand, the leading Bolsheviks who took over Russia were not Russian. They hated Russians. They hated Christians. Driven by ethnic hatred, they tortured and slaughtered millions of Russians without a shred of human remorse. It cannot be overstated. Bolshevism committed the greatest human slaughter of all time." The fact that most of the world is ignorant and uncaring about this enormous crime is proof that the global media is in the hands of the perpetrators. Unquote. Found on the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium website, there is a poem called "Through the Eyes of a Child." Quote, "In the 1920s, 1930s, the people of Ukraine lived north of the Black Sea on beautiful terrain. The villages, cities, towns and farms, trees and flowers grew all around. The people were hard-working and strong, proud of their heritage and bountiful land, and dearly yearned someday to see their beloved country, Ukraine, independent and free. The people were content to live their lives as God had meant, to tend their families, homes, animals and farms, to pray to God and go to church, to celebrate traditional feasts, to laugh and dance and sing their songs. And blessed with land rich in minerals and soil, Ukrainians lived a life filled with hard work and fruitful toil. Their fields were vast and ripe with wheat. The land was rich, black soil ran deep. They grew all manner of food to eat, cabbages, fruit, berries and beets, sunflowers, turnips, grains and seeds, and everyone in Europe knew that the Ukrainian breadbasket grew, the richest grain and golden wheat, that weaved and danced upon the wind, and pushed its stalks towards the sun. Baskets were filled and stored away. Food would be needed each wintry day. At harvest's end, the people prayed to thank God for all he gave. They also prayed in the dark of the night that no one come to take away that which belonged to them each day. But in their hearts, Ukrainians knew the enemy not far away was coming closer every day. The communists from Russian lands formed into new dangerous brands. They came to force all farmers to forfeit their lands and join collective farms. With guns in hands, the enemy came, in trucks and tanks, on horses too, in wagons, trains and on foot. By threat of force they swarmed the land. They took away all the food and grain, till only stalks, husks and empty fields remained. The people knew not where to turn, as hunger took its terrible toll. Day by day the sadness grew. The sorrow, fear and despair they felt was beyond all words to tell. Mothers held their children's heads and pressed them close upon their hearts to hush their cries that they had no milk or food to give, and many people died on their beds. People searched and hunted for food through meadows, woods and fields. They took whatever they could find to eat, leaves, seeds, grass, even tiny birds. But as time went by, no matter what they did, however hard they looked and searched, all their precious food was gone. Still, people prayed upon their knees and asked for help in their great need. Candles lit in the dark of night, they begged for their help in their desperate plight. But no help came from far or near, and soon became very clear. Roaming the land like ravaging wolves, the horror of the famine was here. Over the land all you saw were bloated bodies lying there, starving children and people dying. Death's grim reaper hovered everywhere. The land which once was golden and bright turned into darkness overnight, ravaged by crops torn out of the ground, tears mingled with blood to stain it brown. All across East Ukraine, crosses and graves covered the terrain. Death didn't care if you were big or small, bodies lay dead where they fell. Few were left to mourn them all. After the ruthless communists came, millions of people died in Ukraine. Borders were sealed as though with a shroud. Help for Ukraine would not be allowed. No nation would answer her plea. The world would not know or see the hunger and genocide brought to be by the communists in 1933. No one answered Ukraine's call. No one heard and no one saw. Millions of Ukrainians fall. And that is a poem describing the Second Holodomor. There was truly no limitation to who could be persecuted by the Bolsheviks. Children, the elderly, women, you name it. The Russian Orthodox Church, Greek Catholics, Latin Catholics, and Christians in general were targeted and oppressed. From those who were living through these times, it must have surely looked like the end of the world. In mid-1933, Trotsky moved to France after the left-wing government agreed to give refuge to those exiled from the Soviet Union. However, the move faced strong opposition from the French Communist Party when Trotsky tried to rally support to overthrow Stalin. Trotsky also tried to encourage German communists to rise against Hitler and fascism in Germany. As a result, the German government put pressure on France to expel Trotsky. In 1935, the Norwegian government allowed Trotsky and his family to move to Norway. While in Norway, Trotsky wrote "The Revolution Betrayed." In his book, he criticized Stalin's Soviet Union, stating how it did not measure up to the ideals of the 1917 revolution. Whether their feud was legit or not, both men represented both sides of the Jewish-controlled Hegelian dialectic. They were both sides of the Jewish dichotomy. According to holodomorinfo.org, Matvei Berman became head of the Gulag on June 9, 1932. He was an NKVD functionary who became chief from 1930 and became deputy chief from 1932 to 1936. Berman remained until August 17, 1937, and in 1935, by his own count, he was in charge of over 740,000 prisoners in the Gulag concentration camp system. Yet it is Naftali Frenkel, a Jewish businessman and member of the Cheka, who is best known for his role in the organization of the work in the Gulag, starting with the concentration camps of the Slovensky Islands, recognized as one of the earliest sites of the Gulag. Frenkel personally invited the notorious "you eat as you work" system, also known as the nourishment scale. Like the larger scale Holodomor genocide, murder by starvation, this destroyed weaker prisoners in weeks and introduced a phenomenal death toll, greatly supporting Lenin's bloody war of extermination. Nikita Khrushchev also played a very significant role in the Holodomor genocide of 1932 to 1933. On the basis of performances in the Bolshevik-engineered famine in 1934, he was promoted to a full member of the Communist Party of the Soviet construct. 476 different camps that were part of the Gulag system have been discovered by historians, dispersed throughout the territory of the Soviet Union. However, most of the actual Gulag concentration camps were located in Siberia, perhaps the most brutal part of the Eurasian continent, where prisoners were sent to suffer the harsh conditions, freezing cold temperatures without proper heating. Most people were worked to death, starved, or freezed to death. It is not known how many people died in the Gulag systems, but it is estimated that over 1 million people died or were killed in these concentration camps, which is more than all American combat deaths in every war the United States has ever fought in. Just think about that for a moment. Every evening in Kolyamar concentration camp, the guards would read out the names of those who would be shot that night, before taking them out to be executed. Once, 169 men were shot and their bodies were unceremoniously thrown into a pit. Their bodies were found encased in ice in 1998, fully clothed and intact. These Gulag systems also had the financial backing of Jewish bankers in New York and London. These Gulag systems also became the envy of the West. By the end of 1935, the age of legal responsibility was lowered to 12 years old by Stalin. This meant that children over the age of 12 could be treated like adults and exiled or executed if they were deemed to be guilty of crimes against the state. Genrikh Yagoda was one of the greatest Jewish murderers of the 20th century. The GPU's deputy commander and the founder of the commander of the NKVD, Yagoda diligently implemented Stalin's collectivization orders and is responsible for the deaths of at least 10 million people. His Jewish deputies established and managed the Gulag system. After Stalin no longer viewed him favourably, Yagoda was demoted and then executed, and was replaced as chief hangman in 1936 by Yezhov, also known as the Bloodthirsty Dwarf. Yezhov was not Jewish, but was blessed with an active Jewish wife and is believed to have been a Freemason by many historians.
In unseren Augen, da muss der deutsche Junge der Zukunft schlank und rank sein, flink wie Windhunde, zäh wie Leder und hart wie Kruppstahl. Was wir uns unter der deutschen Jugend der Zukunft wünschen, ist etwas anderes, als was die Vergangenheit sich gewünscht hat. Wir müssen einen neuen Menschen erziehen. Was es uns gelang, dem deutschen Volk eine neue Idee zu geben und dieses Volk in diese Idee zu einen und zu einer neuen Lebensform zu führen. Dies ist der größte Tag dieses Jahrhunderts für unser Volk. Erst einmal in der Geschichte unseres Volkes wird ein Reich gebaut aufgrund des Willens des Volkes selbst. Ich will dabei in Zukunft nichts anderes sein, als was ich in der Vergangenheit war. Warner meines Volkes, Lehrer meines Volkes und Erführer meines Volkes.
In 1936, censorship of literature increased. Lies attempting to cover up the famines and slaughters in Russia and Ukraine were continuously promoted by internal media sources, all of which were Jewish operated. In this same year, the Politburo passed a resolution to protect the USSR from spies. The commission chairmaned by Nikolai Yezhov was given the power to purge spies from the USSR. This measure was the beginning of the Great Terror that was to see Stalin remove his opponents in a series of purges that would last 2 years. These methods of terror were applied not only to prisoners in interrogation rooms and cells, but also in public places, forcing people to get together to witness these atrocities. Stalin, during the years that led up to the start of World War II, started to grow with paranoia about Trotsky. Trotsky, who had been sentenced to death by the USSR, was offered refuge in Mexico. Stalin, concerned by the fact that the Red Army had been established by Trotsky and that many generals had been appointed by Trotsky, purged the army. 8 generals confessed to treason following torture and were executed. 34,000 soldiers were also executed over the following 18 months. In 1939, Stalin was satisfied with the Trotskyites being purged from his ranks, and he announces the end of the Great Terror. On the 1st of September 1939, Hitler invades Poland and World War II is officially declared. During World War II, we know that the banking class of England, the City of London, the Russian communists, and the Zionists in Russia and America worked together for the political expediency of the Jew in hopes of a creation of a Jewish state, as noted by the Balfour Declaration, originally signed in 1917, promising Rothschild the Palestinian state. During the year of 1940, around 15,000 Polish army officers were murdered in the Katyn forest by Stalin's forces. This was later blamed on the Germans. Later this year, Trotsky was assassinated by Stalin's agents in Mexico. During the Second World War, now with Trotsky gone and Stalin in charge of the military, his inability to lead the country's military effectively resulted in many unnecessary deaths. The total number of Soviets killed as a result of war exceeded 20 million people. With attitudes about communism shifting in the West, and the top-down effort of the bankers ordering the suppression of anti-Soviet literature, those in America who spoke favourably about Stalin were graciously awarded, while those who spoke negatively about Stalin or his genocidal tyranny were persecuted. This had caused the pro-Bolshevik attitude to reach America. Bennett Cerf, Jewish founder of Random House, suggested withdrawing books critical of the Soviet Union during World War II. When the Soviet Union was starving its people, Walter Duranty, an Anglo-American journalist who served as the Moscow brewery chief of the New York Times for 14 years, wrote, quote, "There is no famine or actual starvation, nor is there likely to be," unquote. A statement that was met with praise. Duranty also received the Pulitzer Prize. The Pulitzer panel commended him for his reports marked by scholarship, profundity, impartiality, sound judgment, and exceptional charity. The war was in many respects a continuation after an uneasy 20-year hiatus of disputes left unsettled by World War I. The 40 million to 50 million deaths that occurred in World War II make it the most bloodiest conflict, as well as the largest war in history. The Yalta Conference, also known as the Crimea Conference, was held from the 4th of February to the 11th of February 1945. This was the World War II meeting of the heads of the government of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, which was designed to decide on the final strategy of the war against Germany and Japan and settle the post-war future of Europe. The three states were represented by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Premier Joseph Stalin. The United States military-industrial complex, through President Roosevelt, who died only 2 months after the conference, was all too happy in handing over Poland and the rest of East Europe to Stalin. Many of these countries became communist countries after World War II and the build-up of the coming Cold War. The cooperation between the Soviets and the Western powers during this time should be duly noted, as it would be mostly forgotten by most. The fact of the matter is, both sides of the dialectic were being set up strategically by Jewish banking elites. However, with the aid of America, the British forces, the Russians were able to defeat the Germans during the war. Germany signed an unconditional surrender agreement ending the war in Europe on the 9th of May 1945. Soviet workers were given the day off. For many, it was the first day off they had in years. Throughout the war, they had been expected to work 12 to 18-hour shifts 7 days a week. By the end of World War II, the Soviet prisoners of war held by Germany were returned, against their will. Stalin deemed them guilty of not following his orders to evade capture, and they were all exiled to Siberia, where most of them died. In 1946, Winston Churchill made his famous Iron Curtain speech, where he warned the Western powers against the expansionist aims of the Soviet Union and stated that an Iron Curtain had descended across Eastern Europe. This would eventually start up the Cold War and the nuclear arm race. Despite the fact that Winston Churchill not only passively accepted Poland and Eastern Europe being handed over to the Soviets only a few years prior, he played a major role in facilitating for the political expediency of the Jewish Soviets and the political Zionists many years ago. Winston Churchill was not concerned about a Cold War. This was a plan all along, and Churchill was merely playing his part. With World War II now ended, the Soviets became victorious. One would assume that this would mark an end of the industrialization, famines, and unnecessary killings. However, the year of 1946 brought in what would be known as the Third Holodomor. The last major famine to hit the USSR began in July 1946. It reached its peak in February through to August 1947, and then quickly diminished in intensity, although there were still some famine deaths in 1948. Economist Michael Ellman claims that the hands of the state could have fed all who died of starvation. He argues that the policies of the Soviet regime being different, there might have been no famine at all, or at least a much smaller one. Ellman claims that the famine resulted in the estimated 1 to 1.5 million lives lost, in addition to secondary population losses due to reduced fertility. Once the war was over, the Russian concentration camps filled back up, and this time to even greater numbers. By 1953, the gulags combined for an estimated prison population of 2.625 million people. From the years of 1928 to 1953, around 14 million people passed through the gulag system, with another 4 to 5 million going through the labour colonies that weren't explicitly gulags, but worker camps nonetheless. On the 18th of September 1947, the CIA was created, and on the 14th of May 1948, we see the creation of a Jewish state in Israel. Joseph Stalin was the first world leader to recognize Israel as the Jewish state. Stalin was also very happy to help the newly found state of Israel by sending the Jewish NKVD down to help along with money and supplies during its initial founding. Despite the Cold War brewing in full view of the public and the psychological warfare being waged against its peoples, both the Soviets and the Western powers of the United States and the United Kingdom were all equally instrumental in furthering the goal of Zionism and the establishment of a Jewish state, with David Ben-Gurion, a Jewish terrorist who came from Russia-controlled Poland in his youth, as its leader. David Ben-Gurion was also part of the Jewish-Russian Revolution of 1905 and was in communication with Winston Churchill throughout the years that led up to the Rothschild banking establishment of a Jewish state in occupied Palestine. By the end of 1948, Stalin had been nominated for a second Nobel Peace Prize. With the Cold War theatre raging on and the Hegelian dialectic at full work, we see a new age of social engineering which has become very clear in the media, which is still present there today. And on the 5th of March 1953, Stalin dies. The ideology of Bolshevism and Marxism is still alive and well today in the West. They serve as a tool of international Jewry to undermine its host nation. An example of this can be seen in the Republican Party of the United States. These neoconservatives are pushed by the very same people that financially sponsored Trotsky. The militant misotheist worldview pushed by Lenin is also very much alive in the Democratic Party. communism was always a Jewish tool used to purge Christianity and freedom. Although it is believed the Soviets lost power years ago, the Jewish hand behind it is very much alive today. The Soviets and their system of psychological warfare never disappeared. The psychological warfare being waged against us all is very much the remnants of communism that served to enslave us without a single shot being fired. Are we unconsciously buying into a system of slavery, technocracy, militant misotheism, martial law, a hatred of God? Are we doing so under the guise of freedom, innovation, and peace and security? If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. Share it around on your favourite social media platform, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're new. If you want to support our content, you can hit us up on our Patreon page, where you can support us for as little as $1 a month. I also want to thank everybody who's currently on our Patreon page. If you have any feedback you would like to share with us, please be sure to drop it in the comments section below. Thanks for watching.